right? Why? Just before it enters into the love that moves the universe, the Trinity as the image of that love, that is this multiplicity and unity which coexist together. Right? The possibility of drawing the many into one, that's the problem of attention itself, and the problem of understanding how those coexist, they coexist in love. And it's not just an arbitrary thing, because it's a problem you face with the glass as well, because the glass is not one thing, right? The glass is a bunch of things, and it's a bunch of things that are a bunch of things, but nonetheless, for some reason, we are able to see that it's one. Like, what is going on? And I think the answer to that is love. Well, you don't like the word love because it's too sappy. Like, let's just use the word care. We could use the word Heidegger used. That's fine. That's what drives us into seeing unity in multiplicity, is love of the good that one gives you. Whatever that one is, like whatever thing you see as one. A car is not one thing, right? A car is millions and millions of things, but nonetheless, you're able to perceive it as one because it offers you a good that draws you into itself. And so that's also true for, let's say, at the primal level, it's something that you could find for all the categories. It's a phenomenon. I'm also, let's say, saying that the phenomenological experience of reality is primal. It's before whatever scientific categories you give. So the reality of a tree is first phenomenologically the good that it offers, and then if you want to start breaking down its cell structure, that is helpful and it's fine. But that there's a good in which we first even know that a tree is one thing. Because I know it sounds obvious because we all experience it all the time, that we just see unity and we think that it's an obvious, like, oh, it's just one thing. Well, it's not. Well, it is, but it's not. And that's the problem that I think Dante is giving us some image of. And that's why I do believe that I think that's the highest. I think that it is one of the reasons why we have the image of the Trinity, is to bring that mystery into the highest good, into the source of all things. You could say, source of all things is one and many at the same time. It's a perfect union, perfect multiplicity. And so it brings us into this image of what the source of reality is. And if we say that, if we don't, and it's actually a problem-solving thing. I do believe that it's true. I am a Christian. Like it's a revelation. But it is also a problem-solving thing, because the systems that look at the unity of all things as a monad, as an absolute monad, they tend to understand multiplicity as degenerative. They always tend to move towards the notion that the multiple becomes evil in itself. That as you move from the one to the many, you're moving into evil itself. So you see different Gnostic systems that have that structure. And so, of course, the problem of positing just some, I think very few systems would do that, but just positing some multiplicity as the origin, the complete origin, I mean, just means that we're just going to be fighting all the time. Everything's going to be at war with each other because there's no notion of unity which holds it together. So I think the Trinity is there to, I think one of the aspects of the Trinity in the context of this conversation can help us understand that is how, especially even in the way that Dante presents it, the notion of, when we say God is love, it's not just a sentimental thing that we're saying. We're saying that the source of reality is bound in this principle that draws us together, but also doesn't reduce us to one. Because that's also one of the important aspects of love, is that if I love you, I want you to exist as different from me, right? Because if we collapse the difference between you and I, then there's nothing to love anymore, right? So there's a sense in which, as I approach the thing I love, I both want to be united with it, but I also want it to have a certain distinction from myself, or else it cannot be a source that draws me. And so the notion that those two aspects of love, which is one, the unity and multiplicity coexisting, basically, is the way that I see it as helping to solve a lot of these problems.
My take on phenomenology is it's not necessarily to posit it as a philosophical solution to what we're going through, but it's mostly to use it as an example of a way of encountering meaning that is different from this kind of rationalistic, abstracted vision, right? And that the position of the conscious being, receiving this given world to them in a certain manner, is the position that is presented in Scripture,
right?
And it really is the position that is presented in all the ancient stories. And if we can't. And it is the position that you live in. Like, let's be honest. Like the idea of the scientific way of understanding reality is an abstraction. You do not live in that world. Like the solar system is an abstraction, folks. Like you never encounter the solar system in your life, and you never will, right? And nobody really will, right? You can't encounter the solar system. It is a kind of weird point of view from nowhere that abstracts a system and then presents it to you in a kind of schema. And it doesn't mean that it has no value at all. It does have value. It has value for certain reasons, but that is not the world you live in. The world you live in is the same world that Homer lived in, thousands of years ago. And if we can re-enter into that space, then it's valuable to us because we can recapture all the meaning of the ancient stories. Without that, we are aliens to our own stories. We read the ancient stories and they just look like a bunch of weird mumbo-jumbo superstitious nonsense. But that is not useful, right? That is not a useful world to live in. And there's a type of alienation which is part of that point of view, because the same person who has that type of thinking, and it's like, oh, this is all nonsense, mumbo-jumbo stuff, and this ridiculous idea of heaven above and all this blah, 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 blah. It's like that same person will play video games and will literally put themselves in a reductive version of an ancient cosmos in order to find some kind of excitement for their life.
Right.
And so if we can just kind of enter back into our body and walk outside and see that light comes from above and darkness is below, and the idea that hell is underground is one of the most reasonable propositions ever, and the idea that God is in heaven is actually quite reasonable based on your experience. If we can kind of re-enter into that world, then all of a sudden we have access to the ancient magic. Like we have access to the ancient spirit that animated all these stories once again, and you can do that without being naive. You can still believe in rockets and and quasars or all that stuff. It doesn't matter, but they're secondary, right? They're not the primal position. And so that's why I tend to talk about phenomenology, and that's one of the reasons why I think Heidegger is so important, is because he opens up that possibility once again for us. He's one of the people that opened it up, and his insight in that opening up, is very helpful to understand human making, the way that we deal with identity, the way that we deal with what presents itself in care, right? So the Dasein, Heidegger's idea of care, is very important. Like it's very important. Like you can read Dante and Heidegger, and you can say, well, actually, when Heidegger talks about Dasein and the idea that the field of experience is made of care, it's like that's what Dante's talking about too. And that's actually when we talk to a lot of the cognitive psychologists today, and that's what Jordan Peterson talks about, and John Vervaeke and all these people, is that identity is actually based in care. There are no identities, abstracted identities, that they're related to relevance, and so these are all the best categories for people to live in. And it can really, like, going back into that world can really pull you out of nihilism, can really help you not, all the kind of Neil deGrasse Tyson type reductionist arguments, they just go away. They just fall. You don't even hear them anymore, because it's like, well, I don't even know what are you talking about? Like, none of these things are important.
Yeah, I'm glad you.
Maybe it's just the problem of what a person is, because to me, I mean, maybe that's where we're hitting a rock here, because you read in the fathers, you read in the mystics, they always say, you are not your thoughts, you're not your feelings, you're not your desires. All of those things, that actually doesn't constitute your person. Like a person in Christian language is an instantiation of a nature. Like that's a person. And so there's a nature, which is human nature, and then a person is a person. Like it's a human, and that's what a person is. And so it's the actual it's the landing of a nature. It's the landing of the nature in an actuality. Like so it has a.
I need you to be a little bit more specific. Sorry for interrupting, because I don't want to lose, because I think I'm going to be misunderstanding you if I let you go on. So
the word, when we say,
I'm just worried about everything instantiates a nature, right? Like trees instantiate treehood. I mean, that's the Platonic.
Exactly. Well, you would say, I mean, in Christian language, it's the opposite. Like it's the opposite of the. I mean, I don't have a problem with this emergent thing, but like give me the little moment language to see it from the top down. Let's say.
Yeah, Jonathan, it wasn't a challenge question. I wanted you to. I need to see where the specificity of personhood comes in, other than in the instantiation of a nature, because everything instantiates its nature.
Exactly. Well, everything. Exactly. But so it's the idea of is the notion of hypostasis. Like that's the idea. That's the idea of a person in terms of Christian language. Like it's an actual tree. It's not just it's not. So that's what to me.
So it's fair to say you see personhood in the being meant as the active presencing of a tree. You see personhood in that. Oh wow. Oh,
person in the sense of hypostasis, like in the sense of I mean, not in the sense of. Can I say this? Not in the common sense that we understand person in the sense of an individual, like a human individual, but
there's more to that. I mean, that human individual sense, we extend moral rights and privileges to it. That I extend those to you that I wouldn't extend to a tree, because I consider you a person.
Okay. Right? So I mean, obviously, it does also depend on the nature of what is being instantiated. So the idea, like, let's say, in terms of understanding personhood in terms of Christianity, the way that we understand personhood is that in communion. It's almost like emergence. It really sounds like emergence. That as a person, I am in communion with other persons, and that is what makes me exist as a person, because I'm as a person, as an instantiation of my nature, in communion with other instantiations of the human nature. That's how we exist as humans. That's what makes people. That's what makes human. And so the instantiation. So the Trinity is what makes God.
No. There's something like the idea that, because I've acknowledged sort of the idea from Whitehead that possibility, first of all, as you know, I think possibility is real, it's ontologically real. The possibility has to be structured, right, in some way. And that sort of emanation is how that plays out in how constraints are found within reality. Constraints are instantiated from the way possibility is really structured, something like that. And that's a very Neoplatonic notion, and you can see it clear in Whitehead. But they were Mary sort of brought this idea, and then JP did something interesting with it, that isn't there something analogous to relevance realization in that infinite possibility self-constrains down to the finite things. This is an act of self-constraining that's very analogous to the self-constraining that's at the heart of relevance realization. and it's very much kind of analogous to love, because in love you're doing this sort of you're doing an inherently self-limiting thing that's also a self-transcending thing, because Erogenus sees creation as God's ultimate act of self-transcendence. Right? God is because all of the creation still remains within God, right? And so there's this ultimate act of self-transcendence. And I thought that was a really strong argument, because you could say, okay, there's something analogous. It's not the same as our finite relevance realization, but this, if you'll allow me a metaphor drawn sort of from the language of physics, there's a collapse of infinity into finite things. It's a self-constraining. And we always find that bound up with how we care about things, and so analogous for us, it feels like kind of like what love is. I'm being very hesitant here, right? And then of course we can enter into a communion with it that gets the mutually accelerating disclosure, which of course is experienced as we can fall in love with that. So I'm sort of prepared to acknowledge all of that.
Okay, interesting.
But like I say, I don't. I just sort of give it one hand.
No, but this is a good line. Like the way that I see it is similar to what you say. I don't use the word possibility. I just use the word infinite. I like the word infinite because infinite can really just mean even categorically infinite. That is, it is boundless in every manner. So you can imagine that the notion of God as boundless. So we believe in one God, the Father, right? And this boundless, completely boundless. And then the Son, like the Logos, is exactly what you said. It's not limiting, but it's like the expression of the boundless, and through that expression, that's how limited things appear. But what's important, like I think, and that what's important in Christianity, this is the most important thing in Christianity, is that the expression of the infinite is equal to the infinite. That's the most important thing. That's the most important thing in Christianity, and that's why the whole fight in the 4th century was all about that. Is to say that the expression of the infinite has everything the infinite has, which seems contradictory. But what it does is that it makes the world exist. Like it makes the world exist and be real, and not just be an illusion.
And both the top and the bottom are God for Erogenus. Creation ex nihilo is creation ex deo, right? So I was wondering, what do you think about that idea and this gets into John Reiki stuff too, because this is why there's this guy named Filler who he's talking to our friend Eric about recently. He talked about Heidegger and Neoplatonism and how relation is actually ultimate, because it's quite complex. But basically, you could go, and he's an Nishitani, right? This Japanese author who talks about, in the West, nothingness is negative. It's this kind of, it signifies, sort of like in Plotinus, it's evil. Nothingness is evil. Whereas Nishitani, nothingness is, and the East, the Far East, that is, tends to view this as more kind of a realm of potential. It's actually kind of the fountain of all things. And so where do you see the mediating point between these two things? And why is it still, nonetheless, despite all this kind of non-dual stuff, most appropriate to say God is in heaven, God is identified with heaven, even though he obviously transcends the duality?
Okay, so stuff is definitely the kind of stuff you shouldn't talk about, because this is the problem. So a good way.
Sorry, John.
No, it's fine. It's fine. So it has to do with the problem of secret, and it has to do with the problem of what the dark potential, what its purpose is, right? And so if you think of, there's a mysterious way in which we talk about, God as being beyond being, and there are even some of the church fathers that use very strange words, like I think it's Saint Isaac the Syrian who talked about the womb of the divine. Okay, so these are very difficult notions that are difficult, and one of the reasons is because some of the aspect of God that is beyond being is the aspect of God that we should not speak of, because that's what it is. That's what it is not. Right? That's the problem of things that are beyond being. And so it's very dangerous to want to talk about all that, because you are betraying its mystery in the very pronunciation of the mystery. And so this is one of the problems of the mystery of the feminine, and why everybody today wants to talk about the divine feminine. Like everybody just wants to. It's like, let's talk about the divine feminine. Let's what's the divine feminine? What is that? And the answer is shut up. Like, that's basically the answer. Is like to the extent that there is a relationship between, let's say, the lower aspect, or the tohu bohu, and the non-being of God, then you should not talk about it. It's pretty simple. I know it's annoying, because the things we talk about, they're the patterns. They come from patterns of being. Therefore, that is what we talk about when we talk about God, because that is what positive speaking is. Positive speaking and propositions and all the things that are related to pattern and light and manifestation, those are the things that make up meaning and make up language and make up the things we can encounter. And so then when we say God, we say God in heaven, because God in heaven, that's the only thing you can even talk about.
Right.
And I think that it's really important to understand, like, this is the problem of non-dualism. I always say Christianity is a non-dual religion, but it is the problem of understanding that non-dualism manifests itself in dualism, right? You do not have manifest non-dualism. In order for non-dualism to become something that you can even speak about or encounter or allude to, then you enter into dualism, and you have to respect the reality of dualism when you speak about it. And that's the problem of all the weird esoteric crap. Like, all of that stuff is, I think, is a misunderstanding of this problem, which is they're trying to make non-dualism manifest, and they're doing it in a way that is destructive to reality, because they try to get that dark stuff out, right? You know, the whole cliche, you know, about the Sabbateans, right? Like this notion that, you know, the Jacob Frank type esotericists that say, well, if God is beyond being, therefore we should also break the law, right? Because God is not bound by that, and if we want to transcend duality, then we should both follow the law and break the law.
Vajrayana.
Yeah, and that is like a vortex. That's like bringing a vortex into reality. That is literally a monster eating the world. You know. Now, the truth is that the non-dual aspect of God did manifest in the world, but it looks like a king on a cross. Like, it looks like the crucifix. That's what it looks like. It looks like, in order for it to be true, it has to be a self-emptying. It has to be a kind of you know, the paradox of the crucifixion. That's the only way. And I think that the crucifixion is the only fully manifest, or, you know, eternal temporal collision that helps us understand the non-dual aspect of reality, and the non-dual aspect of God as well.
Does mind emerge out of matter as a product of it after the fact, right? Or is mind in some ways prior to matter, structure and giving it structure and organization?
Yeah, constraining it, definitely.
Yeah, and I think the fact of the matter is, there is no way of saying, if you're going to be a materialist, an atheist, a nominalist, you have to say that mind is sort of an emergent property, right? That somehow the matter just sort of evolved, it chaotically developed over time. You get complex organisms that eventually become conscious, and you have to make it a product of matter. But once you say that, then it makes sense that you would have to say that mind is also imposing all these structures, because the structures we're describing are mental structures, right? Ideas, you know, rules, principles, logic, order, you know, and yet, if you're a realist and you're saying, well, no, order and groups and structures are just there, right? They're part of the fabric of reality. Then you actually have to suggest the opposite. You have to suggest that somehow the principles of mind and of ideas and of reason are there at the foundations, giving structure to reality. And once you say that, now you have to say, well, then that means that the world emerges from something like a mind.
Yeah.
And now I'm back to something like God, at least something godlike. Now, the reason I think this is important is because what that means is, once you look at the world that way, whether you're looking at it through like Plato's realism, you know, or Aristotle's realism, or Philo of Alexandria's Jewish realism, or, you know, Gregory of Nyssa's Christian realism, right? Whatever it is. What happens is that knowledge and reason becomes inherently mystical. That as I look out and I recognize a structure, I recognize Jonathan is human, right? Okay, got it. I am in some ways abstracting, apprehending, you know, partaking in a divine idea.
Yeah.
Right? There's something inherently mystical just about the fact that the mind that gives structure and order to the world is something that my mind either is a spark of, if I'm a pagan like Stoic, right? Or is an image of, if I'm a Jew or a Christian, and that image, I'll go with image since I'm an Orthodox Christian, you know, is apprehending something that originates from the divine mind just in the act of perception.
Yeah.
And I say, even in the act of perception, you don't even have to go as far as reason, right? When I look out right now, I look out and I see, okay, we always talk this way, right? I see a table, I see a computer, I see a human, I see a camera, right? Whatever it is, right? The fact of the matter is, we always attribute that to the eye. That's the empiricist's mistake, as if the eye sees that. And the answer is like, no, the eye doesn't see that. The eye gives you all this data, right? It gives you this, you know, stuff that we call light and shadow and all this sort of stuff. But what happens is that the mind so automatically says table, chair, floor, human, cat, dog. And it's so automatic and it's so immediate in identifying those groups, which is what allows you to differentiate all the things in your field of view. We presume it's the eye, but it's not. It's the mind. And if it's true, if realism is true, and that somehow these structures are divine in nature, they originate from God, whether you're a pantheist or you're a theist or you're a panentheist, you're a pagan, you're a Christian, you're some form of a realist in this way, then what happens is that basic perception is already a mystical experience. So you want a mythologized world, You're already in it the moment you embrace realism. And now the reason I think that's so important is because rather than saying, well, there's a mystical side where we think about the occult and all that sort of stuff, and then there's a materialist side, rationalist side, and you create them separate, you treat them separately. I think the key is once you really embrace realism and you understand a realist metaphysic, you realize that it's all mystical. The world is mythologized. Yes, sure, it's haunted with spirits, angels, demons, God, all this sort of stuff. Yeah, that's real. You're a spiritual being, afterlife, all this sort of stuff. Sure, morality, all the rest. But even prior to that, just at the basic level of you existing in a structured way and you perceiving those structures, that basic level of existence is already mystical.
Yeah.
And I think if you can grasp that, now reason can begin to come in and provide some guidance, some discernment, right? About, what are the structures of morality? What are the spirits I should be talking to and shouldn't be talking to, right? Reason can start to have that say that's been sort of pushed to the side without in any way nullifying the pursuit of the mystical. So that would be my pitch.
Yeah, I totally agree. And anybody who's been watching this channel for a while knows that this argument that you're presenting so eloquently is one that I'm constantly referring to, which is that there's magic every time you perceive unity and multiplicity. Because that is magic. That is the moving into one. It's as mystical as we're all united with the one in a Platinian mysticism. It's like that happens when you're grabbing a pen. By the way, it's like all the multiple moves into one, and then you have this mystical experience of the unity of the pen. It's like but then scale that up, and then you're in church and you're doing the Jesus prayer or you're but it is all the way down into everyday perception.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I also think is that because there's been people have mocked the ancient vision of how they would describe our experience of vision. Even Christ talks about it, like that you have the ray that leaves the eye and hits the object. I think that's absolutely true. I think that ray is attention. Like that, there is a ray that leaves your eye. We call it attention, and that attention, is the part of the magic which brings groups into one. And so it's not like it's not that it doesn't exist out there, like you said. It's not like it's imposed, but it's this deeply participative act where human consciousness participates in this magic and bringing these groups, because the groups can change. Right? Like the chair. If there's a fire in the room and I'm running out, it's like, the chair is no longer a chair. It's just an obstacle to get to the door. It's real. It's a real obstacle that I have to get out of my way, or it's a weapon or whatever. Like the groups can change and they're all real, but there is an aspect of human consciousness which plays a part in that magical transformation.
Yeah. Well, I think that participatory side of perception that you're talking about it's as far as I can tell, it's the only way to overcome skepticism. So all of skeptical arguments, whenever you look at the skepticism of the Enlightenment, right, it's always based on an alienation between the perceiver and that which is perceived, right? So
I think relevance realization basically does that same thing that evolution does. It's a self-organizing system in which you would introduce variation and then selection. Your attention's doing it right now. There's a drive to open up, mind wander, vary, and then and what you're doing is constantly evolving your fittedness, your optimal gripping. So
towards some end, which is the dialogue of the conversation.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
and whatever that's embedded in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're doing this.
Exactly.
Yeah, and there's a space of associations beside what you're doing.
But what I'm saying is evolution actually presupposes an ontology in which that will work.
Right.
So that's the deeper point. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So that you should have something to say about that.
We've talked about that before. Like when we did that thing on Genesis, and you talk about how it's this idea of a psychic projection. But the idea that, let's say Jung, for example, could imagine that you could psychically project patterns and onto the world means that it presupposes that the same problem. That means that those patterns are presupposed in the manner in which the world exists for that to even be
right. And the historians of science I've read who attempt to embed the development of science in a Judeo-Christian ethic by necessity, also, giving obeisance, let's say, to the influence of the Enlightenment, say that the notion that there was a logos, there's an ontological logos as well as an epistemological logos, was a precondition for the development of the scientific attitude. And I think that's true.
Yes, and I think, and that's the cornerstone of ancient epistemology. You don't ask the question, how from this, the workings of my mind, do I get to the ontology? You ask the question, well, whatever knowledge there is presupposes intelligibility, right? And then I have to ask, what must the world be like such that that intelligibility reliably exists? It's a very different orientation.
That's for sure.
Okay, so, but let's take it that this is at least a plausible argument. The promise that intelligibility is wedded to reality and that we can realize it through something like relevance realization, cognitively or biologically, adaptivity through evolution, right? That promise is continually made, but we can give no explanation for it because given what we've just said, every attempt to explain it presupposes it as a fundamental thing.
Okay, that seems just fine to me.
The fact that the promise is inexhaustibly kept is the good.
So that's like the a priori structure of being. Before there's actually beings. It's like there's a potential intelligibility even for the finite in relation to the infinite.
Exactly, because and what you can do is you can reject that fundamental goodness. And notice, I can't give you an argument to get you back into it. But if you reject that fundamental goodness, you see Descartes wrestling with this because he tries to, he gets sort of stuck inside the cogito, right? And he's trying, and
I think, therefore I am.
Right, and he realizes, I could be trapped in solipsism and skepticism. And what does he do? He says, no, there must be a God that guarantees that the intelligibility, the clear and distinct ideas, map onto reality. He realizes he needs something outside of the argument in order to guarantee that fundamental goodness that makes everything else possible. But then what he does is he creates famously a circular argument for that God. And so he tries to make an argument for it, but he ends up presupposing the very thing he's trying to prove. This is what I mean by our apprehension of it is not something that is produced inferentially. It is an apprehension of this fundamental goodness. And I can't give you an argument or an evidence for it. Now, I think ethical goodness is dependent on and reflective of, at times exemplary of, that ontological, if you'll allow me, goodness.
And don't you think that that's the reason why in so many traditions, the infinite is always referred to negatively, like the whole notion of negative theology or...
Oh, that's interesting. Say more.
Well, the idea that if you want to express that which is the source of being, you end up having it it empties itself.
Yes.
It empties itself of all characteristics, while recognizing that it is at the same time the summation of all characteristics. It's like the good ultimately is that which everything is culminating to, and then it's a kind of giving away into something which is always more.
And you think that's related to that a priori acceptance of the existence of the relationship between intelligence and being?
Well,
It's this thing that guarantees that is being pointed at to by these processes.
I think so. I don't know, I can take you on this experiment that I've talked about. This idea that identity is kenotic, that identity always kind of empties itself into more. So you always use the example of an object, like you have a cup, and then you have at a certain level, you have different aspects of the cup.
Yeah.
So in order for it to reach its good, all these elements, in order for them to reach its good, they have to give themselves into something which cannot be found at the level of their elements. And so what you end up having is you have hierarchies of beings that are moving towards that identity, but as they reach their highest point, they actually empty themselves into the higher identity. And then you move up, and then you end up with something that is beyond being ultimately.
Okay, so let me try something to you, because that might start to sew the good and the true and the beautiful together. I've been doing a lot on marrying Merleau-Ponty with Plato, and John Roos and other people are doing this, so I won't. But here, like that thing you just pointed out. So Merleau-Ponty's point is you can never completely see any object. So let's just talk, because the number of just even perceptual aspects is unlimited.
Which is what Picasso was doing.
Right. And then, of course, there's the imaginal aspects. I can also, all the functions that are implicit in this, all the use, like, right? And then, so one of the things I've been arguing is that if you take a look at Plato, the eidos originally meant the look of a thing, but he didn't mean the look. He meant something like the aspect. And here's what so you have all of these aspects, and they're unfolding inexhaustibly. There's a through, but they don't unfold chaotically. There's a coherent through line that runs through them. Right? You get a sense of, as you said, the identity. But here's the thing: that through line is not itself an aspect.
No,
it can't be, because if you're making a fundamental,
it's an a priori necessity,
right? And it runs through it. But notice how, right? First of all, that's starting to get us into a sense of the goodness, because that's the promise being kept. The through line is the promise being kept.
When we taled about the idea of the through line,
yes, I think that's the eidos. I think that's what the form is in Plato.
Well,
it isn't what Aristotle thought it was. It isn't just a specificity of necessary and sufficient conditions.
So would you feel comfortable with the notion that it's the manner in which the multiplicity is gathered?
It's the logos.
Right. And so it actually gathers multiplicity.
Don't listen to my words. Listen to the logos that gathers them together. All things are one, right? Heraclitus.
So then what we would presume provisionally is that the thing that unites the true, the good, and the beautiful is the logos. Now, we shouldn't make the presumption of knowing that we understand what that logos is. We've got some hints about what it is, but we can't characterize it entirely. Is that a reasonable proposition in your estimation?
I think so. I think especially if we're careful to do what you did before, which is we have a dipolar way of invoking the logos. The logos is both the gathering, all right, the through lining, if I can put it that way, but it is also it is also the ontological reality that affords that happening. It's the fact that I can't exhaust it, right? No matter how far I push it. So whatever through line I have is at most a signification or a symbol of the fact that it's inexhaustible. Did that make sense? What I'm trying to say?
What do you? No, I'm not trying to understand. That the through line is the significance that it's inexhaustible in the manner in which it points up, or in the manner in which it inexhaustible like this, or inexhaustible in
the manner in which it's the fact that intelligibility between representation and actuality remains regardless of how far you push it.
Okay,
so that would sort of be like the notion that the universe is logical, logos-based, essentially. And that we're not going to run out of that.
But it's not going to be logical in the modern sense
Right.
of a complete system, even though Godel tells
You
us
can't
we
reduce it to an algorithm.
Exactly. So see, this is what I mean by saying I don't think of the form as like a standard Aristotelian essence, at least how it's been taught to me, which is a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. Like
there's no becoming in that, is there? There's just being.
Well,
right? Because becoming implies transformation of something that's algorithmic, but in a manner that doesn't escape from the logos. And I mean, I think that's how reality constitutes itself. And that's part of the solution to the scandal of induction. It's like, no, you can't predict with 100% certainty what's going to happen next. But what will happen next, despite its unpredictability, like the next note in a symphony, is still predictable.
Exactly. This is what I mean about the good. The reason why Hume couldn't deal with the problem of induction is it requires the apprehension of the good, which is the promise that this is not going to be logical identity, but nevertheless, it is going to be inexhaustibly coherent. It's going to remain beautiful, and in that sense, it's always going to be something to which you can conform.
It's not reducible to an algorithm, but that doesn't mean, well, you said it, that doesn't mean it's not habitable, doesn't mean it's not good, it doesn't mean it's not coherent.
Exactly.
Right.
So yeah, and so you could say that about pretty much everything that exists. I like the glass because it's just easy. So the idea is that there is a through line in this glass, but the through line goes through potentiality, which is indefinite. Mm-hmm. It is, I can encounter a million glasses in my life, and they will all be different.
Well, that's like the realm of musical possibility.
Exactly. But they all end up being predictable to a certain extent once I grasp it. Like when I see the glass, I recognize it, but I couldn't have predicted that this is the glass that would exist. There's a kind of potentiality which is maintained within the identity of the glass, but it's inexhaustible.
Right. And when you see that, when you apprehend that, and this is Scari's point, this is being struck by beauty. You see the tree, and it's like every other tree you've seen, and yet it's not. It reminds you of the eidos. It reminds you of just what you said.
And that's love. I think that's love too. Like in love, in the sense that I've often said, love is the capacity for unity and multiplicity to exist. That's what love is, right? That is that I recognize something of you that we have in common, but I also recognize you're completely separate from me.
And that is love. Both are valued.
Those both have to coexist for love to be real. It has to be separation.
Well, to give the devil his due, I would say that's the kernel of good that the diversity types are pushing. We need to recognize the utility of multiplicity. It's like, fair enough. The problem with that is, well, yeah, but where's the unity here? Where's the unity? It's all diversity. It can't be all diversity because then we're in conflict.
Yeah. So, and we tend to be, the modern world tends towards radical. They tend to want to change unity to uniformity, and then have this kind of crazy exploded multiplicity. Whereas this kind of natural relationship between otherness is exactly this, both recognizing what we have in common and at the same time being kind of fascinated and attracted to that which we have.
Well, you think about the reason this conversation works is because we have grounds for commonality in our understanding, but that would be sterile without the multiplicity because we would just run over the same territory. And so, we hope we aim towards the same thing enough so that we can communicate, but I wouldn't like it at all if each of you didn't bring something to bear on the discussion that I'm incapable of bringing to bear on it.
So the last thing I want to bring up is, of course, I mean, people are going to say I'm Jesus smuggling, but that's the reason, one of the reasons, or where we can understand that in Christianity the Trinity is seen as the infinite. Is the image of the infinite that we have is a contradictory possibility of absolute unity and absolute multiplicity. And so we just throw those two up at the same time, and we say the infinite is absolutely multiple and absolutely one, and you cannot, without contradiction, and you can't reconcile that completely, because that is ultimately it's a problem which fractally appears everywhere anyways, because everything in the world has something in common with everything else. Yes. Whether if it's just being itself, but it also necessarily must be different for the difference to.
There's strong arguments. There's Goodman argument. Every object is infinitely similar and infinitely similar to
which is
other.
a restatement of the problem of perception itself.
Yes.
It's like, well, you've seen a glass, yes, but you haven't seen this glass. Well, how much difference is there? Well, there's an infinite number of differences, as it turns out.
I'm getting clear about what the claim here is. Christianity has what Stoicism has about the logos to the logos, and that's what's always good. And you can align your logos to the logos. Maximus even.
Yeah, he says exactly that.
Yeah. So that's not something for it. But what you're saying is in the form of a person, and not just person, but also hypostasis person, right? Because hypostasis also means substance and principle. We've reduced it to our Lockean notion of what a person is. So it's person in this fatter sense. Is that fair too? Yeah. Okay. And then that gives you imaginal access to binding your logos to the logos in an even more profound manner.
Or even relational, in the sense that the way that we experience
And this is why, in some ways, when we talk about principalities or agency or transpersonal agency, is that the best way to engage is with as if you're engaging with an agency.
Yeah.
Not as if you are. Right?
But
Be
it's an
careful.
imaginal
As much as
engagement.
that you're an agency, right? As much
Yeah.
as that in some ways the mode of human engagement is through agency and through personhood. Like that's actually how we engage. And so the claim is important because there's a, the reason why there's been so much kind of arrogance about how silly the image of God, the personal God is, and kind of how just trite and ridiculous it is. But I want to propose that when we engage with virtues, even, if we engage with them as models, and even incarnate models to follow, that's the realist. It's realer than just engaging with it as an abstract principle. So it's like it's like it's an incarnational way of thinking. So I follow examples of wisdom,
Yes,
and
yes.
wisdom itself appears as a type of a agency that I can submit my will to, and so it changes the world back into a world of it changes the world back into more like the ancient world where you have these agencies which come down on us from heaven and that we can follow, and we don't see them as abstract principles or as forms in the way that Plato saw them, but more, I think, at least myself, more like the way that the pagans saw the gods rather than the way that Plato sees the forms.
Well, in Neoplatonism, those two get.
That's right. No, I totally agree.
Yeah. So, first.
I'm going to get you in trouble again by saying things like that. The people that are like Jonathan, the superstitious guy, trying to get John to believe in demons or whatever.
I defended you.
You did an amazing job. Like someone started attacking me, and John has been amazing at defending my position. But I know it's a radical thing, and it's hard for people to get into that space because it's unsettling.
Yeah, but if they don't leave the paradigm they're in to get to that space, they're screwed. That's part of the AI thing.
Yeah, I think it is part of the AI thing, definitely.
But I want to stick on this point because there's two things. So first of all, I think I'm hearing you, and there's a way in which I deeply agree that in order to properly orient logos to logos, it can't just be the cognitive grasp of a principle. It has to be internalizing the stage, because you have to be internalizing perspectival taking and identity formation. That's
exactly right.
And so I think I get that. And please take this as how I'm understanding it, and I'm not drawing equivalencies here, but that's what I'm trying to do in After Socrates, is I'm trying to give people Socrates as a sage that can give them how to internalize perspectives, identity formation, basically, embodies and enacts. Because that's the point of the dialogues. The point of the dialogues is to say, look, there's no definition of wisdom, but here's a person who embodies it. And what the dialogues do is they break you out of trying to come up with a definition in order to find, when they work, in order to orient towards, here's an embodiment, and I can do exactly what you're talking about with that. Now, and I don't want to do quick.
No.
But so I get that, right? And I make it clear in the series repeatedly, I'm not trying to draw equivalencies between Jesus and Socrates, although I think, like in Kierkegaard, putting them into deep dialogue, that's Kierkegaard. That is, I think it's a very valuable thing to do. I think, now, so big yes to that part. And
so this comes back to what I said yesterday. How can you do that in a way that is more than just a mental exercise? So the reason why one of the reasons why I brought up celebration is because that's part of it.
Yes.
Right. So worship and celebration in general is a way to participate and make these things. It's like by just attending to them and celebrating them, lifting them up.
Yes.
I'm making them models for me to follow.
Yes.
And with philosophers, that seems difficult. It's difficult to do. Like unless you would organize like a cult of Socrates, which I don't suggest. I'm not suggesting that.
I'm not suggesting that either.
Well, but it seems like that's in some ways that's the to me the true mode of participation engages that. So it's like I celebrate my father, right? It's like we celebrate the 50th wedding anniversary. We're all there together, and we're there, and we're recognizing that as something to put up on the pedestal, and therefore to follow and to engage with. And it's not the same. It's saying these are the principles of a good marriage. You should follow them.
Yes.
The first one is way more real because it has that, it has exactly all that it needs. It has a kind of liturgical aspect to it where I'm lifting it up and I'm putting it up and I'm saying to everybody, look at this. This is what's valuable. Everybody looks at my parents that they've been married for 50 years and they're like, wow, look at how that's crazy that they did that. Maybe I could do that. We don't have those mental. It's not as explicit, but that's how it works.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's first of all an answer, but before I answer, can I put my finger on the problem I wanted to pose, because the answer will be engaged with that. So the problem you face with everything all the good points you just made. This is why I wanted to push on person. Is our our sort of established sense of person is a creature, is a thing, and therefore, so I put aside all the silly, oh, God's a sky wizard. Those people, yeah, I agree. They're by and large sort of idiots because they're comparing the worst form of religion to the best form of science, which is like I can do that with science too. Like here's Edison, and he's an example of science, and look at how crazy and stupid his method is. And let's look at Aquinas and how systematic he is. See, religion is so much better than science. It's so ridiculous. So I agree with putting all of that aside. But I do think there is a point, and I think the Tillich makes this clear. The concern with idolatry is ultimately the concern with not relating to the ground of being as a being, right? And so that's the problem with the imaginal is it focuses you on a being, right? And yet, and I know Eastern Orthodoxy really wrestled with this, the icon versus the idol, and Jean-Luc Marion is right. But you see, there's a tension there, right? There's a tension also with focusing on. Do you see that?
No, unless, I mean, this is, now I'm going to be very, very explicitly Christian, but if the being appears as someone who dies, and then that being appears as someone who says something like, not me but the Father, right?
Sure.
And so the point, because you don't have a choice, right? That's the problem. You do have to see, or you do have to imagine, but if you do that, and then that's what you have, right? You have an image of a man on a cross who's dying, and he's doing it to fulfill the will of the Father. And so what he's doing is showing how it is a no thing. When it appears as a thing, it appears as an emptying. Right? It appears as a kind of emptying of itself into the world. And so it helps, it gives you that place of focus, you've got it, but you know that it's not, how can I say that it is that emptying, and that it only exists in the vertical relationship.